device, earphones to hear better, but also because there are some participants that are connected online, and therefore this will allow interaction with everybody. We open with the welcome from the President. Margareta, you have the floor, President Sederfeld.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sanier. Dear colleagues, dear staff of the delegations, ladies and gentlemen, it's a true pleasure to meet you again, either in person here or on the web. But I would also like to say, it's a pleasure to also listen to the sounds in the room, because I could see that there is a lot of discussions going on already, and the mood seems quite good. That's excellent. That's a good start. And tomorrow we will shift to our winter meeting for Thursday and Friday. But I am very pleased that there is the informal call for action Helsinki Plus 50 meeting today. And I think the meeting is very timely, focusing on the challenging inside OSCE region in the work we are doing inside the OSCE PA, but also challenging on the governmental side. What we can do to improve, how we can go forward. And I say this because I believe very much in the work we do in OSCE, and in particular in OSCE Parliamentarian Assembly, where we can meet parliamentarians from all over the OSCE region, cross countries, cross parties, and exchange view on the political issues that's important. And that's matter for us, and matter for our national parliaments, matter for our people in the constituencies, for those who have elected us. But it's my true pleasure to meet you here and welcome you for the first meeting of this year for the call for action. And as we discussed here, Ambassador and I, it's the first full-fledged meeting in person. I apologize for those who are on your net. You are also mostly welcome, of course. But I say this with a meeting in person because we haven't had so many meetings, the opportunities after the COVID. But now we are on the track again and meet in person. But first of all, I would like to commend all the efforts done by Ambassador Sanier for organizing today's meeting in the hybrid format. And also, I am very glad that we have such a high level of participants in the panel. I think this shows the also interest for our project with the Helsinki Plus 50. And once again, dear colleagues, we all know what's happened the 24th of February. It was Russia's war against Ukraine, the first day. It was also our first winter meeting after the COVID. And our colleague, Nikita Potorayev, arrived and told us that the war had started. It was an illegal full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and it continued 1 year later. And it affects the whole world, but most of all, the Ukrainian people. And I must say that this illegal war from Russia against Ukraine, it's violating the Helsinki principles, the European security order. They are all under huge pressure. And it's also affect OSCE, the organization where we are elected as parliamentarians. And let me also mention here that OSCE started, it's almost 50 years ago. It's some 1975. And the 50 years anniversary is during the Finnish chairpersonship, 2025. Russia's war, it's a true challenge, but I am very pleased to see that several organizations are united. I could see in my part of the world, European Union is very united. I could see that there is a good cooperation with the transatlantic link. I could also see a cooperation that's growing all over the world. But there are also those who are not joining. And by this, I would like to say that our challenges in OSCE, I think they are all over the world. If we are talking about OSCE, there is political tension, geopolitical tension, there is funding constraints for OSCE, there is the lack of consensus that's needing on the governmental side for decision. For us, for the political decision, it's majority inside the Parliamentary Assembly. There is the cybersecurity threat. There is disinformation, propaganda. But also looking closer to OSCE, we could see that there are missions that are closed or under threat to be closed. I could see that the SMM in Ukraine, it's closed. But there is also parts that works very well. And what can we learn from that? I don't know. I hope that we can learn something from today's discussion. Maybe if something really is needed, or maybe if there is a political pressure, or maybe something else. I look forward to the discussion. But anyway, I think it's important that reinforce the multilateral engagement on how to revitalize OSCE. Because every time I meet with colleagues here in OSCE, I could see the engagement. I hear the engagement, all our discussions and meetings. When I have taken part in the Permanent Council and representing OSCE, I could also see the engagement and also the will to contribute. And why doesn't the organization work? I think it's too easy to say it's because of consensus rules. I think it's to make it too easy. But what can we do? And what is possible? Through joint efforts, cooperation, to foster security and cooperation in the region. I see this as crucial. With no cooperation, it's impossible to work over the border for security. And I will also say that we as parliamentarians, we continue to support the governmental side with all their efforts and commitments to translate the politics, the decisions into real actionable steps toward promoting security, democracy, human rights. And we have now developed our new action plan for Ukraine for our activities. This shows that even if we are an organization who don't have any military, we don't have any fundings, we don't have any mandate to support with finance, we are committed. And that's what's counted. And we are using the tools we have. And let's continue to do so. And I'm sure there are other opportunities as well, how we could go forward and how to support the work inside OSCE. And by this, I mean support peace, stability, respect of rules of law, respect of the commitments to OSCE. And by this, I say thank you very much and wish all of us a successful meeting. And I give the floor back to Ambassador Sanier. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your kind words, Madam President. I would now ask the Secretary General, Roberto Montella, to address the meeting.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Zanier, dear Lamberto, and thank you all. the president has mentioned it. The OSCE is going through what we could call an existential crisis. I mean, many people really challenge the usefulness of this organization, whether it will survive the crisis we're going through. In this room, we have a patrimony of experience of parliamentarians, permanent representatives, experts, the former Secretary General of the organization who knows the organization in and out. I think I could be proven not wrong if I say that in this room we have those who love the organization, who are converted to the usefulness of this organization. So I think we could say that in this room of supporters of the OSCE, it is great that you manage to take time in these moments with all the things that are happening outside this room to also have a kind of a step back and think, okay, let's reflect, because this is a kind of a reflection on the organization. You have great panelists here who know the organization very well, and I look forward to hearing what they think about the organization. But so it's, I would like to commend Ambassador Zanier and President Sederfeld for taking the initiative to have this discussion today in the midst of all of this that is happening outside the room, to actually think, okay, where we are, where is the organization going? Is it useful? Is it not useful? And I think Ambassador Zanier, you have nailed it, because I mean, you're talking about the Helsinki principles. Should the organization be given more teeth? Should suspension mechanisms be introduced? All the things that you will discuss in your paper here, the consensus culture. I think the reforming the organization, there are so many papers about how to reform the organization, resourcing the organization. I think this is a very important issue. No, all of you know me. I mean, I'm a strong believer of this organization. I've served this organization for almost my entire life. I was in the field operations of the OSCE. I was in the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly office here in Vienna. Now I'm privileged to be in Copenhagen as Secretary General. I think this organization does great work. This organization delivers for the people. I commend Osmani. I see there are representatives of the chairmanship here. That has chosen as a theme for this year, the people. I think that if we focus on that, if we focus on who is the end users of all these efforts, the efforts that are happening downstairs, the efforts that take place in the institutions, in the OSCPA, in the OSCE Secretariat, all of this is geared towards the people. So if we focus on how we deliver to the people, I think that we will come to the conclusion that this organization is already very successful. It's extremely successful because I have seen it with my own eyes, the beneficiaries of the organizations, the end users who have seen the OSCE coming into their life and their life improving, I don't know, with the many projects that the OSCE does. I will not go into opening remarks with many of these examples, but the fact of the matter is the organization is relevant. The organization does great work. And I think we have to really, from the parliamentarians, and this is the contribution that the parliamentarians, and here again, I commend you, Madam President, the Parliamentary Assembly and the Bureau for triggering this initiative, Helsinki Plus 50, because I think the parliamentarians, who are the best link to the people, can say, can make the pitch to keep the organization alive, to keep the organization strong, to keep the organization resourced. And I think it is good that the parliamentarians do so through this initiative. It is great that they asked you, Ambassador Zanier, to take the lead on this, because you are the best person, because you've seen the organization from all the different angles, from the CPC, from the Secretariat, from one of the independent institutions. So I think the contribution that the parliamentarian will give to the OSCE is fundamental. I hope that there are many also representatives of the permanent missions. I know that there is at the same time an FSC taking place downstairs, so there are maybe deputy representatives, but the meeting is recorded, is online. So the outcome of this meeting, I think, should really be a contribution that the Parliamentary Assembly and the parliamentarians give to make the organization stronger. So we should work with that goal in mind. And with this, I yield back to you.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. So now we move towards the panel. Let me say a couple of introductory words myself before passing the floor to the panelists. You heard the reference to the paper that I circulated. This is only to prod you a little bit and stimulate a discussion, provoke a little bit on themes that I consider to be important. But in a nutshell, the big dilemma that the organization faces, in my way, has to do with the role and the nature of the OSCE. We often say, and we look at the CSE as an organization that was creating a space for dialogue among enemies, as we used to say. And the OSCE inherited this. It is in its DNA. It's an organization that is able to perform in bad weather conditions. But there is a but. The CSE and the OSCE operated also in difficult circumstances, but on the basis of agreed rules and principles. That was the rules of the game were followed. Now we find ourselves in a situation where the basic rules are not followed anymore. So we are playing a game without a basis, without having the rules that support us. So this has undermined the dialogue. The dialogue now is not really anymore, and it has been for some time this way, it's not really anymore a constructive dialogue among countries that see things differently, but it's really propaganda, it's accusations, it's words that are strong but empty, don't lead to much. And decision making has become very difficult, and we see decisions on key issues important for the survival and the development of the organization, decisions on the budget, decisions on appointments, decisions even on chairmanships that become blocked because of this, because there isn't really a real dialogue. So you as parliamentarians know the importance of engaging also when there are differences, but I think we've gone beyond some of the points or the minimum requirements that are needed for the organization to operate effectively. So what next? And this is the question that we have turned to the panelists, and we will hear their views. This space will be important once we overcome the current situation. It is difficult to use in this context, but the question is, so what can we do? What could the OSCE do today? And what is the potential of the OSCE in future when we will have a new order to reorganize, and we need a space for that? So the panelists that joined us today, the first one is Katarzyna Gardabkadze. You will be familiar with her. She's now the CEO of Responsible Leadership Academy, but she used to work for a long time in the OSCE. The last job in Warsaw as deputy director of the Office on Human Rights and Democratic Institutions, or Democratic Institution Human Rights. She recently wrote a paper with some scenarios on the future of the OSCE. So I think it's very appropriate to have her share with us her views. She will join us online. Unfortunately, as you know, we have no budget for this process, so we have to cut corners where we could. But she was kind enough to take some time to join us and share with us her views. Walter Kemp is he's been 2 decades in and out the organization, various roles. He's the real policy planning with whatever his titles were at each moment, but he was always the real thinker on where the organization is going, and is still willing to join us and continue support us in this reflection on the way forward. Dr. Friesendorf is the head of the Center of OSCE Research Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. This center is particularly important, apart from the fact that you issued also the yearbook on the OSCE. But on my first day, when I was appointed Secretary General 12 years ago, I proposed the creation of a network of academic institutions to help us reflect a little bit on how to make best use of the OSCE. And his center is the coordinator of this whole network, which developed in the years following this proposal. So it's great to have you here and to hear also your reflections from a slightly more academic perspective. So I think there is a combination of angles that are offered to stimulate the discussion today. So this is for my introduction, and I would like to give the floor to Katarzyna now to begin. Katarzyna, great to see you.
Thank you very much for having me, and I'm going to share the screen so that I can show the presentation, and I hope it's visible. Is it?
Yes, yes, we can. I can hear you.
And see the presentation as well?
Yes.
Good. So a very good morning to everyone. It is a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show to you 4 plausible scenarios for the OSCE to 2025. And I was given 10 minutes for this, so please bear with me that when I discuss 4 possible futures for an organization of this size, I might take a little bit more time. The 4 scenarios are based on 2 critical uncertainties. The first one is the presence or absence of consensus as the main decision-making modality for the organization. And the second one is the presence or absence of dialogue, as Lamberto said, one of the founding principles. And the resulting 4 scenarios I will present in a moment, but a couple of caveats before I do so. The first one is that these are not actual scenarios. The scenario planning methodology and process are among the most powerful tools an organization can use to prepare itself for an uncertain future. But these scenarios are just based on my assumptions and my knowledge of the organization after 11 years of service. They did not follow the actual methodology. There are examples of what could be, and they're intended to stimulate thinking about what the organization should do more or less or differently to advance positive scenarios and avoid negative ones. The second one is that, of course, depending on what parameters you put in, you will get a different output. So, for example, if the parameters were financial condition of the organization and the health of its institutional partnerships, you would have very different scenarios. The third caveat is that this is just at one level. You can do scenario planning at micro level. For example, when I was at ODIHR, we did scenario planning to prepare the office for different variations or possible variations of HDIM. You can do it at macro level, so you can ask about the general regional security architecture or the futures of multilateralism. These scenarios that I will show to you are at meso level, at the level of the organization, and the key survival decisions that are needed. And then finally, as my predecessor said, a lot depends on when and how the war of Russia against Ukraine will end. And the scenarios assume that by 2025, all 57 OSCE participating states will still be a part of the organization, which is not a given. So now on to 2025. The first scenario I call marriage of convenience, and it is one where participating states, for their own particular reasons, want to keep the organization afloat, but they're unable to discuss principles. Now, to keep the organization afloat, they need to, of course, agree on key, survival decisions for the organization. And for this, they need to make silent concessions. And so when it comes to the appointment of 4 key posts, they either might agree on the lowest common denominator, or the current post holders can do concessions on their own to make themselves reappointable. In any case, the result might be weak OSCE leadership. In absence of the CIO for 24, with some stretching of roles here and there, North Macedonia can stay for 6 months longer, and Finland can come 6 months earlier. The UB concessions, as the UB is a continued tool for political control and manipulation, might be that the UB will be lower every year, and at the end of the day, it might be just enough for operations, but not for activities. Human dimension will face, activities in the UB will face further restrictions, including in the field operations. The field operations themselves will be gradually downgraded and closed. HDIM will be taken out of UB, and civil society participation in OSCE events will be further restricted. Normally, some of this could be offset with XB, but in this scenario, economic downturn and high military spending in traditional donor countries will make XB scarce and uncertain. And in that scenario, the organization will be on life support and will have no impact. The second one is called zombie.org, and it is one where participating states keep discussing things, but they're unable to reach any decision at permanent and ministerial council levels. So in absence of decisions, but with the organization still somehow functioning, there needs to be ways to bypass the current decision-making mechanism. So if there are no appointment of the 4 key posts, deputies can act as heads, as I myself experienced possible. If there are no CIOs for 24 and 26, then the organization finds ways to function without the Troika. If there is no UB, then some participating states can take the 2021 UB, the last one adopted, as a basis and make greater contributions towards that and increase their extra budgetary contributions as well. If there are no field operations, then program offices can be opened instead and be fully XB funded, as we see now in Ukraine. And if there is no HDIM, then CIO events similar to HDIM can be organized and fully XB funded, as we have seen last year in Poland. And obviously, with no decisions and resolutions, no one believes anymore then Helsinki 25 ministerial can be a platform for a renewal of the Helsinki Final Act spirit. And there could be some results at activity level, but no political impact. Now, in both of these scenarios, I did not put in what traditionally is a trigger point, a situation that tells us, or a trend that tells us that a certain scenario is likely to develop. And I'm curious what you think the trigger points could be for these two. And now on to the last 2 scenarios. The third scenario I call the abyss. These are not my words. And it is a scenario in which there is no consensus and no dialogue, effectively. And this scenario, both its title and its trigger point come from the press conference that Minister Lavrov gave after he wasn't admitted to Poland for the ministerial last year. And he said 2 things. He said that the organization is sliding into abyss, which is why the title. And he also said that Russia will no longer put any constructive proposals for dialogue on the table, and instead it will wait for the Western countries to do so. Now, in these scenarios, the Western countries will not put any constructive proposals for dialogue on the table because of principles. The war is still going on, and also because there is no real vision for what the future of the OSCE should look like at the moment. So with all existential OSCE decisions not taken, the organization is rendered non-functional. It doesn't have leadership, it doesn't have CIO beyond Finland, it doesn't have money, and it doesn't have field operations, the 6-month mandates of which are not extended. Which means that by December 2025, there is a non-consensual announcement that the activities of the OSCE are temporarily suspended, but in fact, premises are closed all over the place, staff is laid off, and no activities are carried out. And then finally, there is a scenario that I call Phoenix, thanks to input from the Helsinki Committee of the Netherlands. And this is a trigger point for this would be a situation in which OSCE acts as a successful broker of a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine that ends the war. And with this development, not only OSCE participating states all agree on the OSCE potential as a security organization, and also they see and want to address its shortcomings as an organization. And so they make new commitments. They will work together on renewing the Helsinki Final Act spirit and make it relevant to today's realities. They will hold an OSCE summit in 25, where they can lay out their proposal for a new security architecture in the OSCE region. They will collectively reflect on best ways to overcome organizational deficiencies, and they will do all of this with active and broad engagement and contribution from civil society. There will be timely decisions on all key organizational matters. The Permanent Council will work towards greater efficiency and accountability of the OSCE. Field operations will have new or adapted mandates, and where they were closed, they will reopen. And the OSCE will gain stronger reputation as an important and impactful regional security organization. Now, for each scenario, there is always a set of questions that we might ask ourselves. And this is what scenarios are intended to do. They are intended to stretch our thinking. But I want to put only 3 questions on the table for further consideration. And some of them were voiced already in the introductory remarks. The first one is funding of the OSCE. Can we, based also on our national experiences, come up with a funding mechanism for the organization that is stable, predictable, sufficient in size, and free of political interference? And I'm saying this because there is a tendency to supplement or substitute unified budget with extra budgetary contributions, but extra budgetary contributions as they are today meet neither of these 4 criteria. The second question that I think we need to ask ourselves is whether consensus is still a feasible decision-making modality for the organization, not only because it is used as a veto power in the OSCE and elsewhere, but also because in the age of the global democratic dissensus, it would be helpful to think whether it is a modality that pulls the organization down instead of giving it wings to fly up. And finally, the issue of dialogue. I hear even senior OSCE officials saying that the OSCE must remain an open platform for dialogue, including with Russia. The problem that I see here is that even if we take the most modest definition of dialogue, what we have seen in recent years in the OSCE does not meet this definition. So how do we define dialogue and what would be its purpose? Thank you very much. Apologies for taking a bit longer, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Katarzyna. This was interesting and stimulating. I'm sure there will be comments. Can I interrupt a little bit, just one very short interruption with a little anecdote? Some 10 years ago, I started wanting to develop a cultural volley in the OSCE, and I tried to stimulate cooperation. We even had concerts in various countries. But I found an Italian artist, a painter, who wanted to donate a painting of hers. It's an abstract painting to the OSCE. So I accepted on behalf of the organization. I hanged it down. It's still there, I checked, in the second floor, just outside the Neue Saal. And it's abstract, of course, but it has a title, and the title is The Phoenix. So let's hope that this is coinciding with the most positive scenario that Katarzyna just gave us, and it could be good omen. Let's hope so. So let's move on with the discussion. Walter, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Lamberto. Thank you, Madam President. Thank you to the Parliamentary Assembly for this initiative. It's great to be back in the OSCE. I think I'm living proof that you kind of never leave the OSCE. Exactly 1 year ago to the day I was in The Hague, I was launching a book that I wrote called Security Through Cooperation. And as you can imagine, there were a few remarks about whether this was really the best of times or the worst of times to be launching a book called Security Through Cooperation. 1 year after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I believe the message of such a book is actually more relevant than ever. The subtitle of my book is To the Same End, and it's a play on words. The definition of cooperation is to work together to the same end. But if we don't cooperate, we're going to land up in the same end, which at the moment, as we can see, is not a good place. In that respect, I'd like to use this opportunity to actually reinforce the case for cooperative security. Let me start by stressing that cooperation is not appeasement and it's not pacifism, nor should cooperation be viewed as the absence of conflict. Rather, it's a reaction to conflict or an effort to prevent it. If we all lived in harmony, then we wouldn't need cooperative security organizations. Therefore, cooperative security is usually an aspiration rather than a fact. In cooperative security arrangements, as you know from your experience in the OSCE, countries seek to work together in order to manage their relations peacefully. It's not to solve everything, but to manage relations, to increase predictability, and to de-escalate tensions. As opposed to collective security organizations or arrangements, where the partners are more or less like-minded and usually united in a defensive alliance. Lamberto often uses the expression that the OSCE is 57 not like-minded countries. I think that's a big challenge, but it's also the utility of the organization. So this difference between cooperative and collective, think of the difference between the OSCE and NATO. There is a place for both collective and cooperative security. Think back to the NATO doctrine of the late 1960s that talked about deterrence and détente. That was the Harmel report. However, today there's no talk of détente. Many leaders admit that the war in Ukraine can only end with mediation, but at the moment there's little sign that mediation will end the war. Both sides seem to think the time is on their side, the enemy is a threat to their existence, and that the war will end in victory. President Putin seems to have the same mindset as Vladimir Lenin, who said, "You probe with bayonets. If you find mush, you push. If you find steel, you withdraw." Over the past year, I think Moscow has been surprised at the steely resolve of Ukraine and its allies in the West. The question is, can Putin afford to withdraw? That said, at some point, ladies and gentlemen, at some point, Russia and Ukraine will have to make peace. They cannot change their geography. They will always be living next to each other. So they're going to have to find a way to live together. The stronger Ukraine is, the greater the incentive for Russia to cooperate, not only with Kiev, but also with the West, which is why they need to continue to be supported. But the more Moscow feels threatened, the greater its desire to defend itself, which could cause instability in its neighborhood. The warning signs of this security dilemma were evident for years, at least as far back as Putin's speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007. That unresolved security dilemma has resulted in two simultaneous conflicts, one between Russia and the West, and one between Kiev and Moscow. And I would argue it will be hard to resolve one without the other. At the moment, we're very much looking at the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, but there's a bigger set of issues that need to be looked at. The OSCE's role in ending the conflict between Russia and Ukraine will probably be limited. At the same time, its work is almost paralyzed as a result of that conflict. That said, it's vital for the OSCE to survive, since it will be the logical place to rebuild the European security architecture after the war. I think there's a bit of a space between zombie.org, the Abyss, and the Phoenix. I also dream about the Phoenix. I would argue in the middle, there's probably something I would call OSCE a la carte. The key is to keep the lights on, keep people around the table, even if there are cuts, maybe there's not that much dialogue, but keep the OSCE alive. In that respect, it's not enough to analyze the conflict. You see plenty of people on TV analyzing how the war is going to evolve, or we analyze what's going to happen with the OSCE. We need action, which is why I very much appreciate this call to action by the OSCE PA to de-escalate this dangerous tit-for-tat spiral that we're in, that we saw most recently from the speeches yesterday. I would therefore raise the following questions for your consideration. For those who say that Russia should be kicked out of the OSCE, what would be the added value of the OSCE without Russia? And for those, including Russia, who think that it's important to maintain channels of dialogue, my question is dialogue to what end? As Katarzyna just pointed out, where is the dialogue? There's a lot of monologues, but there's not a lot of constructive dialogue. For those who say there can be no business as usual, I would ask, okay, but does that mean no business at all? Or should we try and do things differently? I often hear, not most recently in this room on the way in, some people say now is not the time to talk about these big picture issues. How can we talk about OSCE 2025, 50th anniversary of Helsinki Final Act? Other people say the OSCE is more relevant than ever. Our challenge, and I think what I'm trying to drive at here, is those of us who still believe in cooperative security and an inclusive pan-European security arrangement should be thinking about what post-war Europe will look like and what lessons can be learned from this horrible war and the period leading up to it. Concretely, I think that lessons can be learned from conversations held during the darkest days of World War II, when a group of countries came together at Dumbarton Oaks in 1943, this was not 1945, but 1943, to create a new international organization out of the ashes of the League of Nations. Or the early 1970s, when consultations were held in Finland and Switzerland to discuss problems relating to security and cooperation in Europe. And I've sometimes used the expression, I think we're talking more about Helsinki -3 than Helsinki +50. It's a bit more like the early 1970s. And how could we even have the kind of conversation that we hope to have? Let's not go back to pre-1975. We should preserve what we have. Nevertheless, I think that we're back to basics here. It may be difficult to have those kinds of conversations among the 57, at least for now, but creative formulas could be found for informal dialogue. And it will be important to engage civil society and parliamentarians. Let's not forget the important role played by Helsinki committees in the 1970s and 80s. Unfortunately, there are not too many of them around anymore. I would like to believe that there's a critical mass of people across the OSCE area who do not want nuclear war, a return to dictatorships, and a divided Europe. Their voices need to be heard. In that spirit, we need to mobilize all those who want to stop Russia's aggression, to halt the escalation of this conflict, and to urgently seek ways of rebuilding peace, stability, and good neighborly relations in line with the OSCE's founding principles. At a minimum, this requires keeping open channels of dialogue and using them constructively and creatively. The OSCE is one of the last places where these group of countries meet. As I mentioned, we need to basically keep the OSCE alive and hold informal consultations on the future of European security. At the moment, the only place I see that happening is in the OSCE-PA, and I think we need to somehow scale that up. As it says in the Parliamentary Assembly call for action, and I quote, "We need decisive leadership to steer the OSCE community towards the vision and the ambitious goals set out by our former leaders, a vision we share and we feel bound to promote and to help our organization navigate the troubled waters ahead." The war has shown what happens when cooperation fails. The alternative is doing what our predecessors understood in 1945, in 1975, and in 1990, namely fostering security through cooperation. Let's continue to work to that end in the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly and in the broader OSCE community. Thanks for your attention, and I look forward to the debate.
Thank you, Walter. And now to Cornelius, the visitor.
Madam President, Ambassador Zanier, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this important event. If you allow me, I will discuss one of the topics mentioned in Lamberto's paper, which is the question of suspending or expelling a state from an international organization. Of course, in light of Russia's war against Ukraine and debates within the OSCE to suspend Russia. My main argument is that any attempt to suspend a state from an international organization should take into account two aspects. The first aspect is whether the advantages of suspension outweigh the disadvantages. And the second aspect is whether suspension is practically feasible. So I will first briefly outline advantages and disadvantages of suspending, excluding a state that has violated basic rules, which is the case with Russia, and then mention some alternatives to all-out expansion or expulsion. First, a couple of potential advantages of suspending, expelling a state from an international organization where the state has grossly violated core principles of the organization. One advantage is it can strengthen the credibility of the organization. So suspension signals that the organization stands for its principles. Another advantage is it may lift decision blockades if the state that has violated core rules also blocks consensual decisions. A third advantage is threatening a state with suspension or lifting suspension might induce a change in behavior. Now, this sounds good, but now comes, I'm afraid, a long list of potential disadvantages. Once an organization has suspended a state, it will find it much harder to make the state comply with the organization's principles. Whether it's through pressure and conditionality, I mean, the OSCE is very weak on conditionality anyway. They're very different from other international organizations. Whether it's through adjudication, this is also something the OSCE is not really doing, this is Council of Europe, or through arguing and socialization. Then suspending, it might also harm the reputation of the organization because it signals that the organization has basically failed to socialize that state into proper behavior. It deprives individuals of the suspended state from any protection, any advantages they receive from their state being part of the organization. So, and I think this was one of the major reasons why the Council of Europe for so long hesitated to end Russian membership in the Council of Europe. It was only in March 2022 that Russia was expelled from the Council of Europe because of the implications for Russian nationals to go before the court. Another disadvantage, it prevents cooperation with the suspended state on matters of common or global interest. If you think about climate change, probably the biggest threat to humankind, you need Russia to talk about ways of averting or reducing global warming. Then the violating state might not return to the organization even after a change in behavior, and that precludes cooperation. Important term, cooperation, as Walter said, with that state. Suspension can also increase financial pressure on the organization if the suspended state is a major contributor. And importantly, suspending a state might not be practically feasible. And here we really need to keep in mind the political realities within the OSCE. So states allied with the violating state might not support suspension exclusion. States allied with the violating state might also leave the organization. And if, say, we could imagine the OSCE without Russia, but it's very hard to imagine the organization without 5 or 6 or 7 other participating states. And if there is agreement on suspension, the suspended state could use allies remaining in the organization to block decisions. Another problem, suspension might be legally questionable, especially when there are no statutory procedures for suspension. Then there might be charges of illegality. And more problematically, it raises the problem of selectivity. So within the OSCE, you not only have Russia that violates OSCE principles, it's probably the most extreme case currently of violations. But there are many other participating states that on a daily basis violate OSCE commitments. So there could be charges of selectivity. So as I tried to outline, there are pros and cons of suspending a state. Whether the advantages of suspension outweigh the disadvantages depends on various factors. On the international organization we talk about, for example, is the IO a club of like-minded states? as Lamberto has said many times, the OSCE is not a club of like-minded states, at least no longer since the late 1990s. Then it depends on the state violating the rules. And I would propose to you that suspending Yugoslavia from 1992 to 2000, Yugoslavia was suspended from the CEC OSCE. That is a very different case than suspending Russia nowadays. So what are alternatives to excluding suspending a state? There is, among researchers, there's no agreement, basically, whether the pros outweigh the cons. There are a couple of alternatives. A partial suspension of rights. For example, the state representatives can be excluded from some activities of the organization. The Council of Europe, for example, has suspended some rights of the Russian delegation, including the right to vote after the annexation of Crimea. So before March last year. The UN General Assembly has suspended Russia from the Human Rights Council. Other options include walkouts, as we have seen within the OSCE as well, and then use the organization as a forum where the violating state has to explain its behavior again and again and again. And by doing so, you might not induce a change in behavior, but at least you're protecting the norm that is being violated. And it's also possible to create coalitions with allies of the violating state. Another alternative is take decisions without the violating states if necessary, such as running activities using voluntary funding. And we might be seeing a paradigm shift in the OSCE. Think about the support program Ukraine, a big sort of almost de facto field operation, which is not a proper field operation, without Russian consensus. And that might be, I think, part of what Walter called keeping the organization alive. So this concludes my very short overview. It would be fascinating to hear your views, including what this means for the OSCE, or maybe you have experiences from other international organizations. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Cornelius, and thanks to all the speakers. Now the floor is open for the debate. A couple of technical points on the debate. If you want to intervene, you have please speak in the microphone so that everybody can hear you, also those who are following us remotely. If those who follow us remotely want to intervene, my colleagues will take note and they will give me a list with the names of those who want to participate in the debate. So this can be interactive also, involving those who are following us online. So this is it for the ones in the room. I don't know everybody's name, so just you know, raise your hand and I'll give you the floor in just pointing at you. So who wants to go first? I think after these rather intimidating presentations, but I think it's, you know, lots of rather fundamental questions are on the table.
Nobody breaks the ice. I just use one word to say thank you to the three speakers, because this is the most clever reflection I've heard in years on the OSCE. All the scenarios that have been put in front of us are things that we should really think about. We are so much charged with emotions about the contingent that we are not capable of seeing the substance. And again, monumental congratulations to you, Lamberto, for bringing us here in this very moment, choosing this, because it's all you're making. We have to be honest here. I mean, I take the credit for launching this, but the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly and the Bureau has hired you, Lamberto, to choose these speakers and to make us reflect on these issues. You put them on the papers, but we are really talking about fundamental things that we will maybe, these are pearls that we've given out here, that maybe because of the contingent situation, we are, you know, one word, somebody said, oh, don't suspend the Russians, so we will jump on that and say, but let's forget about the contingent and think about the case that you've made for the organization is fantastic. So I really thank the three speakers. Katarzyna is connected. I love the way you have you have made your scheme on 4 things. So just huge thank you, and I hope that this triggers debate. I hope that we are recording this because we have 32 participants and I don't many here, but I would like to broadcast this also for those who are downstairs and those who are in 57 capitals, political directors of the OSCE, and maybe foreign ministers at some point, to think about the great value they have here, this precious tool that they have, the OSCE, and how little political interest there is in it. And, and try to kind of put a little bit the fire on ministers and on those who decide on this organization and say, do we want to keep it because of all the good reasons that we've said? Or let's say the world is, we are in a new phase, then close the shop and let's do something else with more robust means. Please, thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. We start having now speakers, and the first one actually is not physically here, is Christian Strohal, who is following us online. It's great to hear from you, Christian, and to see that you're still following the debates we're having. You have the floor.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, albeit from rather sunny Morocco, as you can see, but I could not possibly pass this opportunity to be with you, because first of all, I think this is a great initiative you have been taking at the right moment. And secondly, because I was looking forward to these presentations, and I think we agree that we were not disappointed. These were three great presentations on a clear problem we are all facing together. No, so my point would be simply a sort of practical question, maybe, to the presenters, but also to you, Lamberto, and your personal experience. And that is, I'm with Walter in saying we need the organization and therefore we need to keep it alive. So what has been one of the key factors, I think, throughout the history of this organization is something one could describe as doing by doing. Simply using everything you have in addressing concrete practical issues through the institutions, through coalitions of the willing, through the efforts of the Parliamentary Assembly. And I think that is probably something which is also necessary in looking at all the other issues which are currently overshadowed by Russia's war. And this doing by doing necessitates a few practical steps which can be taken and should be taken. And one of them, of course, would be a much stronger involvement of the parliamentarians in the Parliamentary Assembly, not only in the meetings of the PA, but also back home, in strengthening the practical support for this organization, including, of course, funding. So that's my little contribution there, but I'm certainly very interested in see how this debate continues to evolve. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christian, and we'll hear what the panelists have to say on this. But I agree with you. Doing by doing, I think the president has just mentioned the action plan on Ukraine, and this is an example of how parliamentarians can follow up on this. But in times when making decisions is difficult, you need a stronger leadership, and at all levels. So the chairman in office, the secretary general, heads of institutions, and in this case, the presidents of Parliamentary Assembly. And this is what we are seeing, and this is what we hope we'll be seeing also at all levels of the organization. I keep saying on Ukraine, there are things that others have done that the OSCE should have considered doing itself when it came to the grain crisis, the grain exports, or exchange of prisoners. So there is space where the OSCE could insert itself and try to use the little opportunities that are there. And show itself active on the ground, and not being just fought by the big political exchanges and leave it at that. I see Farah Karim is next. Farah, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And Thank you indeed, the speakers, for their very, very stimulating presentations. So very much appreciated. I have actually, I think all of us, at least that's my feeling, when I heard the word, the Phoenix scenario, we all were happy. So we felt there is hope. There is a scenario of hope. So, and all the three speakers, they made great analysis. Now we are sitting here as parliamentarians, as part of actually the political community in our countries, with maybe sometimes very little, but sometimes also more influence on the decisions that our governments take. Now, what I would like actually to ask the speakers is, so agree with everything you said, but what's the next step? So what is actually your recommendation to move towards the Phoenix scenario, if possible? So I would like really to hear your thinking about so practical recommendations. When we say the war, everybody agrees, and I think I am also one of them, agree that the war will end and has to and must to end by negotiation and mediation at a certain point, but we are not yet there. So what can we do? What is possible? Maybe you have thought about it a little bit more than we have done, and I think that would be great really to hear your thinking about that. So please help us to find the way to Phoenix, if I may say it so.
We're in the same direction as Christian's question. I see Perepons wanted to please.
Thank you, Lamberto, for giving me the floor, and thank you very much for all the intervention, for the analysis. I think it was really great. And I think it gives a fantastic framework to think about the future. And then just let me share some thoughts and ask a bit of feedback like Farima. First one is on what Roberto said on the existential crisis. It reminded me the situation at the EU level described by Jean-Claude Juncker and Jean Pisani-Ferry. There was a time of existential crisis 6-7 years ago at the EU level. And I think in the last 3 years, you can realize that there was a strong answer to the COVID crisis and to the Ukrainian crisis. So even in the worst moments, also the Brexit, because we forgot it, you also can, let's say, restart or do a reset. And I think it's a good lesson to learn. The second point is that Olaf Scholz said in Prague that we are in a new era, no, in a new time. And there is also this idea, this article in Le Grand Continent, in which it is said that there is this era of new idealists, the status quo people and the new idealists. So I think we are all in a sort of transition time, in this kind of Gramsci time, no? So that's what I'm saying, that because we are not, I wouldn't say that we are in an abyss moment, and we are not either in a Phoenix moment. But for me, the challenge, and I address the panelists, is that we are in a key moment in which we have the urgent thing, which is to save the organization, just like that, the urgent thing, and you have to cross it with the important thing. This is what you describe, how to reform the organization. So my point is, how do you do both? Because you have to do it at the same time, both. For me, it's in the end, it's catalyzed change by doing. And then on the question of suspension, I would like to ask, why we have this repetitive question about the suspension, the expulsion. I think geopolitics are back. So if we assume that geopolitics are back, we have to assume that these are part of the geopolitics system. And I will not give my personal opinion, but I think it's even better to have an organization which was created, as Lamberto said, to make enemies dialogue, that even if there is no dialogue, in theory, the enemies, as in the organization at least. So I think to have this discussion permanently about if you have to be or you don't have to be, in the end, is a little bit an oxymoron. It's an existential. So we are feeding the existential crisis. So my question would be especially the fact, how do you cross, or how do you do both at the same time, the urgent and the reforms? So you have to keep the organization alive. At the same time, you have to do these reforms as the first speaker said. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you for the word. I will introduce for myself. I'm Dan Barna, the head of the Romanian delegations, the Parliamentary Assembly, and I'm the first time in this meeting. It was very interesting the analysis you presented in the panel, and it was quite inspiring in terms of options. We are in the functional crisis. It is a fact. I mean, between 2016, I was not at all involved in politics, so I'm a former entrepreneur, so I'm trying to be very practical. So it's clear that the present context put pressure to our organization, to these organizations, to a reform, because it's exactly the problem of the rule of law, which should or must be followed by all the members of the society, irrespective of their status. Because the line it was mentioned here, of course, it was one case with Yugoslavia because they were small, but Russia being so big, we should have a different perspective, because what would be our organizations without Russia? And the idea, in my perspective, it's a matter of rules. As long as we will be able, and this is a good opportunity in this period, to establish rules of what happens when a member of OSCE is attacking another one, because we don't have this previous experience, and we don't have rules for this, and this is the reason of the present crisis. So in Romania, there is a very tall saying, asking a prince in order to receive the daughter of the king, it was asked to find a way to ride a horse and in the same time not ride a horse. So in the end, he find a small pony, but walking and riding at the same time. So we are looking to identify a mechanism where to maintain an aggressive country. Okay, now it's Russia, in future might be another one, to keep it on the table and in the same time sanction it a bit. And I was thinking, listening the panelists, that maybe a sort of decisional quarantine mechanism developed could run in order to having a specific frame of time when the member or members involved in the conflict to not be allowed to participate to the decision, with periodically assessment, giving the open framework for dialogue could be an answer. The idea is we should identify a rule to be respected and assumed for now in the future. And this might be a step or a few steps for that Phoenix perspective, because otherwise everybody's saying, okay, it should be good, everybody should be happy. But in order to everybody should be happy, we should impose some rules which act as normal consequence for a certain position of a state. I mean, every members of our community of OSCE to know by now in the future that if they will start attack another one, this will happen, this and this. And I mean, these are my thoughts in this moment. It's very fresh idea, but I think we should discuss on this from this perspective also. Thank you.
Thank you. Of course, the issue is what procedure is required to change the rules, and so we're back to that kind of problem. I see former President Severin, please.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Zanier. Thank you, everybody. I'm a signatory of the appeal. I see that very few of our initial signatories are able to come here. I was happy to join you I didn't come, I must confess, I didn't come specially for this meeting, but I was in Wien. Christian Strochel is in Morocco, so things are upside down from all points of view. It's obvious that this organization is in crisis. It's obvious that we missed to reach the target, and the target was to keep world in peace within a just, feasible, and sustainable relationship between the states, the member states, the players. But when we are in crisis, usually we have to go back to the origins. And we have to find there maybe possible answers to our problems. And our origin is back in 1975. And from 1975 until 1990, when we had a very important change in this organization, things functioned well. Did we have rules? Yes, we had. We had those principles about which you asked if we have to keep them or change them or drop them. But those principles were flexible enough in order to allow enemies, very clear enemies, to stay together and have a dialogue and have a negotiation and find solution in order to coexist, to survive peacefully. The mission of that CSCE, Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, was to keep the war cool, to keep the war cold. And we succeeded in that. The war didn't hit, the war was cool, and the order was there. What kind of order? A bipolar order, the order of two enemies which were able to avoid direct conflict, the military conflict, because they were able to keep the balance while adjusting the steps every time by implementing and interpreting rightly the rules. Well, we had, I repeat it, one world, a bipolar order. Today, our danger is not to go back towards a bipolar order, but to go onwards to two orders of two different worlds, to fracture the world, and these two parts of the world to be systemically into a conflict, not into a dialogue, not to speak about the cooperative security, not about to speak about the solidarity which is indivisible, but on the contrary, we are going to divide security for two worlds, each of it having its own order, and because each of it is going to defend its order based on its own values, we are going to have a conflict. And this, the danger is, and I'm afraid of it, is that we are going to have a systemic war, because we are not having a bipolar order, but to have two worlds with different orders, conflicting orders. This is not the same with the old ideological war we had during the Cold War. It's something more dangerous and more hard to be managed. In 1990, what did we do? We were very romantic in 1990. We thought that the history is ended. You remember Francis Fukuyama said, okay, now we are all democrats. Now we all are able to make peace within our states and within our societies, and the peace within will be transferred into the peace within the world. So, and therefore we started to multiply the rules, to make the rules more rigid, I would say, to leave a little room or less room for flexibility. And in the end, when somebody breached the rules, we didn't have any answer, except perhaps the wish to expel that one, to punish that one. The OSCE is an intergovernmental organization. The ECE is based on treaties. The OSCE is based on international law instruments. So either we want to have a dialogue, either we want to stay together, we do not want to stay together. But If we do not want to stay together, it means that we have a little leverage on those who are not with us. It means that we cannot influence us. It means that we cannot find an agreeable solution. It means that we should forget about the culture of consensus. We should forget also about the culture of cooperation and of cooperative security. So that is why I believe that our romanticism, when our romanticism of the 90s vanished, we realized that we have less than we had in 1975. And now we cannot go straight back on to 1975 simply because we do not have a bipolar world. We are in danger of having two different conflicting adversary worlds. Should they keep the principles, the question of the excellent non-paper of Ambassador Zanier to go? Yes, I believe so. But we have to remember that meanwhile, new principles emerged. For instance, to the right to intervene in order to protect. Remember what we did in Yugoslavia. We intervened in order to protect whatever we had to protect. How should we match the principle of territorial integrity with the principle of self-determination? In Europe, we thought that we solved the problem of self-determination with a Versailles Conference. We found out that it was not the case. We had, and we still have, problems of self-determination, and OSCE was obliged to face that in the Caucasus, for instance. Say Nagorno-Karabakh, for instance, is still a problem, a question where we should match two principles, which are old principles, and we were very keen to defend them, as long as they didn't conflict. Now we have conflicting principles, so we have to come back not only to the old principles, but to readjust their definition in the way in which they could meet the present requirements. On sanctions, I am not sure I said that the whole three panelists were an excellent presentation, and I cannot say anything more or less than they said. But I want to echo the fact that the expulsion, the suspension, that have less advantages rather than disadvantages. In your paper, Mr. Zanier, Ambassador Zanier, you touch the problem of sanctions. This is very sensitive. Each country feels itself in the position to apply sanctions against another country. To me, economic sanctions are about economic war. We should not hide behind that. If we impose economic sanction, we are in an economic war. So if we want to avoid an economic war, at least we have to put in place a mechanism within the OSCE in order to approach collectively the problem of sanctions, because otherwise each state will start to impose sanctions against the other one, and this would be a mess. Totally a mess. We have to, on the decision-making process. When I was a president of our parliamentary assembly, I advocated, to the change in the consensus rule, because we weren't able to, of course, the change at the level of the governmental dimension, because we weren't able, like today, to make decision if we stick strictly with consensus. Well, I would be again in favor of changing this rule, but I think at this point in time, this is not any longer realistic. Not at all, because we lost confidence. One of the most important products of the OSCE should have been and was the confidence. We built confidence, and as long as a little bit of confidence was there, at least a virtual, conventional confidence was there, we were able to move ahead. Now there is no confidence. And the first maybe point on the agenda of the Phoenix would be the rebuilding of confidence, rebuilding the confidence, and rebuilding, and we have to state, to proclaim again, I believe, that security cannot be but indivisible. We are speaking a lot about indivisibility of security. Yes, in 75, we we considered security as being indivisible. In 1990, even more we consider security as being. Today, I'm afraid that something that security is not necessarily always indivisible. So the OEC as the organization, to my mind, should come back to this principle and to make up its mind. Do we consider the security as being indivisible? Yes. If yes, then we know what steps are going we should do further. So and only if well maybe we can, and just 2 points very quickly. One of our specialty, to say so, was the weapons control and non-proliferation. This was crucial on one hand for building confidence, on the other hand to build security. CFE was a beautiful piece of achievement of treaty, which remain without results eventually. So we have to, maybe that CFE is not anymore feasible, but another one should be conceived. So this is 1 point. Second, it's about the Parliamentary Assembly. Well, I was championing the role of the Parliamentary Assembly. I had to face a lot of disagreement when I have spoken about the oversight of the Parliamentary Assembly in respect of the governmental dimension and things like that. Okay, I still think that Assembly has a major role to play, but don't forget that we decided, I mean, the member states decided to create an assembly when we thought that we are all democratic, that we thought that we are all sharing the same values. Now, but at the same time in 1990, I believe, we have adopted another important principle, respect for diversity. And I think that this principle included the idea that democracy might be diverse. I was a rapporteur of United Nations on human rights. And before I experienced that position, I thought that indeed there is only one set of human rights all over the world. The traditions are different. We can converge, we can make efforts to go towards a common set. For the time being, there are different views on human rights, and between the political regime and the views of human rights is a very strong link. So we have to accept diversity within ourselves in order to be able to continue the dialogue between non-like-minded people in the respect of diversity, and with the hope that by that we can coexist rather than fight each other. Thank you so much for listening to me and for giving me this possibility to contribute a little bit as a lover of the OEC, as Roberto Montella put. I'm here because I love OEC. This is the only reason for being here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Shall we go back to the panelists? Well, let's have another question and then we'll go back to them, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning to all. I'm André Coelho Lima from the Portuguese delegation. It was a magnificent intervention that you made, very useful for us. One or two thoughts I'd like to share with you. First of all, of course, that OSCE is in crisis. Everybody is saying that, but I must say it's a strange crisis. Why do I think it's strange? Because the main function of OSCE should be in these moments and not in moments of peace. When we are in peace, there's no need of OSCE. When we are not in peace, we need OSCE. So it's strange. It is, of course, a crisis, but it's a strange crisis. It doesn't fit my mind. But nevertheless, crisis, like the etymology of the word says, is an opportunity to go forward. One step back to maybe 2 steps forward. That's, I think, the goal in this meeting, in this winter session of OSCE, that we take advantage of this period, of this crisis, to make OSCE visible. Of course, that there's another argument. We have a conflict in the middle of Europe, maybe we of the European countries are not used to that. But there is some sort of hypocrisy on that, because we have lots of wars between member states of OSCE all the time. This one is not different, it's closer, but it is not different. Why should this conflict create a problem within the organization that the other conflicts did not create it? It's strange for me to understand. Of course, I know the answer. We all know the answer. It's closer. It's on TVs. Everybody's putting pressure on us. But we should not lose our objectivity on the analysis of this conflict. It's a conflict like many other conflicts, and our organization should ask itself, what is our paper on solving the conflict? I would like to end with the two bullets that you gave in your intervention. We have the sharing the same values issue and the respect for diversity issue. They are different issues. We don't share the same values, of course. And that is, of course, that is also our objective, to be here, knowing that we are representing very different countries, very different cultures, very different points of view, and that's what we should do. Not thinking on that romanticism that we are all the same. We are not all the same. And that's supposed to be like that. That's a difficulty? No, I think that's an opportunity, and that should be our goal. Thank you.
Hedy Fry, please.
I'm sorry. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak. And I want to thank the three presenters. I think that they made me think, which is important when you're listening to people who present ideas to you. And I think the first thing that I think is important is that the OSCE must survive. But like every important organization, organizations come to a period of crisis very regularly. It's part of the cycle of organizations. And so the crisis presents us with an opportunity to change, to rethink, to look at how we view ourselves. I just wanted to point out that it's interesting that in the word OSCE are two very important words, security and cooperation. How do we achieve security? Right now, there isn't any, as we see with the war. And how do we achieve cooperation at the same time? I think this is a challenge that OSCE must face. But again, I see in this challenge the opportunity to change. And I think flexibility, someone used the word flexibility, our ability to remain cooperative means that we don't always think alike. As we heard, we are diverse nations. We have different cultures, we have different attitudes, and we must come back to looking at this issue, not from a point of subjectivity, which we are all feeling. All of us are, at this point in our times, emotional. There is a tendency to knee-jerk when you are emotional. And I must confess that I have been knee-jerking a little bit with this crisis. But I think it's really important. I like the concept of the two different forms of security, cooperative security or collective security. There is no way that the OSCE can survive if it looks only at collective security, because then we're going to have to just stay with like-minded groups. And then we don't have that ability to look at how we cooperate, to look at how we talk. I mean, wasn't it Winston Churchill who once said, it is better to jaw than to war? At the same time, we are faced with an issue. We have two member states that have violated core principles of Helsinki. Are those principles important? I think they are even more important right now. Let us go back to those principles, but let us remember why those principles were there. Let us remember that there was a time when this region, Europe, changed allies the way we change shoes. I mean, and I talk about shoes because I like shoes. So we changed our allies regularly. One day we were friends with the person, the next one we were friends with a different group and angry at another group. But the ability to maintain that cooperative security is at the heart of what the OSCE is all about. I think we cannot forget that. I think we must remember that. And our challenge is to put aside subjectivity and look at objectivity. If you violate core principles, there has to be some way of punishing or some way of retribution. And how do we do that without completely kicking that violating group out of the system? Because if we kick them out, will they come back? Do we need them? Yes, because we've seen the shifting of alliances over the course of the history of Europe. The second thing is this regional group important? Yes, it is one of the few groups that encompasses Europe, Central Asia, and that encompasses the Atlantic, Canada and the United States. So we are a group of people that are so very different, but we must rise to the occasion and the challenge. I think it is important for the OSCE to continue and to take this opportunity to strengthen ourselves. And I think that there are many things that we can do. Now, the question is, how do we punish the offending state? There are ways we can do it, and I think we heard this today. There are ways of issuing various penalties without completely ostracizing the other group. And we can talk about that. How do we find different penalties? How do we look at ways to punish and to make the position known that you cannot violate the rules without being punished in some way, shape, or form? But how do we keep them at the table? How do we ensure that we work together to move forward? This is not the only conflict. There are conflicts going on all around the world. We thought we were going to get rid of conflict. We never did. We still are going to have to face conflict. And the answer to conflict is to talk. It is to dialogue, even if we don't like each other, to dialogue with enemies, to dialogue with people we disagree with. That's the whole essence of dialogue. So my feeling is this is also an opportunity for the OSCE PA to stand up and to take its place and to say, we represent not just governments, as the OSCE does, we represent parliaments, we represent different political parties, and we, of all people, represent civil society because we are elected by civil society. So how do we make sure that we take the tools we have as the OSCE PA and put to the OSCE ways of dealing? Consensus isn't going to work. How do we find a way to change the way we come to decisions? Parliamentarians know how to come to decisions. We come to decisions with a majority. Different parties come together, we agree, we disagree, but we eventually work on majority. So a majority might be the best because consensus allows for people to remain intransigent. The second thing is, if we have a violating member state, how do we give them the opportunity to back off their position? If we push so completely that people have to save face and remain entrenched where they are, this is part of dialogue. How do we do that? So we have two conflicting things. How do we make sure that there is security? And how do we make sure that we have cooperative security at the same time? And so my feeling is it is a time for the OSCE PA to stand up, use the tools we have as parliamentarians to push the OSCE to change, to reform, to begin to look at things very differently and to realize that as a regional organization that links Europe, Central Asia, and the Atlantic, we are perhaps more important now than ever. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to express my appreciation for the three presentations, very resourceful and very interesting. So I think all of us can agree that big changes and significant changes came after big crises. No matter if we are talking about a revolution in a country or we are talking about Second World War, the most important changes in the geopolitical and in states came after crisis, and we are definitely in one. I think we have to not to look very far back, that the pandemic learned us something. No matter how developed our countries are or how many victims the virus made, all of us had to face challenges in our healthcare system, and we all have to face, we still have to face economic impacts after the COVID. But what have we done, regardless of our country which we are representing? We came up with stronger. And there is a sentence which I read and reflect about it in the material which were prepared for this meeting. Should the OEC be given more teeth? And my parallelism to the COVID is that we came out with more teeth after the pandemic. We enforced our healthcare system. We enforced our financing system for crisis, to not face such a big economic impact. And I think we have to take this example also for the OCC. I agree with what my colleagues say. We have to go back to basics, and meanwhile we have to figure out what could be this teeth. Should it be more regulations, sanctions, measures, and how can we deal in the future? Because the truth is we are going still have war, and we are still having frozen conflicts, even in between the states which we are representing. And this is a point which we have to reflect and go back and change how we function and change how we deal with these states. There was also another point was regarding the role of the OCC as a key broker of the Russian-Ukrainian peace agreement. It's a little bit hard to think as, for the OECC as a key broker in this matter. But one thing, in my opinion, is certain, that a key broker in reconstructing Ukraine after the war, the OECC is going to have. And for those scenery, we have to be prepared. So these are my two thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anybody else before I go back to the panelists? So I don't see any other requests for the floor. So Katarzyna, are you still with us?
I am, and I'm listening very carefully to all these excellent ideas and interventions. And allow me a personal remark, Heidi. It is always a tremendous pleasure and inspiration to listen to your thoughts. I have always enjoyed it, and so did I today. I wanted to say a couple of things. For crisis as an opportunity, I agree. Because as many of you have said, crisis is something that makes us learn faster and kind of accelerates the change curve very quickly. But I also wanted to say, and those of you who have known me in my OSCE shoes will know what I'm talking about. I have always been very vocal to the point of people not liking me really about the risks that this organization is facing, but by not being prepared to name and face a crisis. And I think what we are seeing today is partially that. And I think what is an important change is that it has named the crisis now. It has actually said we have a problem, which is the first step to actually resolve the problem. I also agree that we don't share the same values, but as many of you said, I think participating states need to agree on the basic set of core principles, because otherwise this organization just doesn't make any sense. This is a framework within which we can function as a cooperative or a collective, or whichever way you look at it, without basic core principles. It's going to be very difficult. One thing I wanted to say, I have been in touch with several civil society organizations, some of which are Helsinki committees. And we discussed about the Helsinki 50 plus process, and how impossible, this was before the war even, how impossible it was for participating states to come together and come to some sort of a renewal of commitment to Helsinki Final Act spirit. And one of the ideas that was discussed in these meetings was an idea of kind of citizens' commitment, all citizens of the OSCE, or well, all, of course, a group, a selected group, to kind of call on states to recommit to some of these core principles. And I'm saying this because when you were talking about parliamentarians being elected officials, people elected by citizens, this is, in my view, a very interesting position. And this could give you this leverage of gathering together what Walter called the critical mass, academicians, civil society organizations, others, to kind of rethink what this renewed commitment to Helsinki Final Act spirit could look like, and kind of build the narrative around it and build the critical mass. One other thing I wanted to say in the context of what next, the practical steps. I think we are all discussing hypothetical scenarios, but we are all kind of discussing them in isolation. And my very strong suggestion would be to actually invest in an actual scenario planning process, because it is a tool to prepare and have answers that currently are speculations in many cases. One other thing I wanted to say is that what I think parliamentarians could do, because I think what is going to inevitably emerge is some alternative ways of functioning. Financing the organization is one of them. Perhaps some stretching of the consensus -1 principle or the silent procedure is going to be another. It's difficult to say now what these will look like, but some of them are already emerging. But when it comes to funding mechanisms, let me say, and I know this painfully well because ODIHR has for years been dependent on voluntary contributions, extra budgetary contributions. What happens is that the procedures for getting this funding from participating states is so cumbersome, the money is so ad hoc and so insufficient for the actual needs, and so unpredictable in timing, that it is virtually impossible to do long-term planning and long-term activity implementation with extra budgetary contributions. And the organization becomes a project office, which is not what it is supposed to be. So one thing is to perhaps advocate with governments to come up with more feasible funding mechanisms for this organization, because it is very important, I think. And I will just throw it on the table, but without anything else. I know that the discussions about the OSCE Charter, I know how they appeared on the table, and I know that they have not been put on the table in goodwill. But at the end of the day, if we talk about a mechanism for keeping a state violating principles accountable, perhaps some return to the discussion on this or that version of the OSCE Charter wouldn't be a bad idea. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Katarzyna. Interesting thought to this, also this last one. Let's proceed. Walter, please.
Thanks very much. The question was asked, okay, this is all very interesting, but what can we do? So let me give you 8 suggestions based on some of the things that we've been talking about here. Number 1, we need to find a chair for 2024 and before the middle of June. You can't appoint a chair in November and think that they're going to start in January. This absolutely needs to be a priority. And I think countries that are in the Parliamentary Assembly can exercise some influence on their foreign ministries. So we keep talking about leadership. The political leadership in the organization is with the chair. That's the way the organization has been structured. So we need a chair. It's not fair to have two countries chairing the organization for 3 years, particularly in these kind of circumstances. Number two, I would argue we need some kind of continuity in the next 2 to 3 years. And because the chair in 2024 will have very short time to prepare, why not have at least among the Troika, since we know who the chair will be in 2025, some kind of agenda for cooperation, if not agreed among the 57, to have it within the Troika, some kind of roadmap with a very clear set of objectives. Number three, we've already alluded to it, and frankly, the formula already exists, but start a series of informal consultations on the future of European security in the context of Helsinki +50, but also engaging civil society, academics as much as possible, a kind of track 1.5 process. Number four, my Canadian colleague was mentioning, you know, what can you do short of kicking a country out of the organization? And I don't want to trivialize the war in Ukraine, but Canadians very often think in terms of ice hockey. Can you create some kind of penalty box in the OSCE where a country would be suspended for clear violation of the OSCE principles, but have the possibility to come back? I think this is something to consider. Number five, the motto of the chairmanship this year is that it's all about the people. When I was coming to this meeting this morning, I said I was going to speak in the Hofburg about the OSCE. Somebody said the OSCE still exists. I think the Parliamentary Assembly can be very helpful in reminding normal people, your constituents, that the OSCE does still exist, that there is a different type of security than only collective security, but there's also cooperative security, and this organization plays a key role, maybe not so much in the crisis in Ukraine, but in so many other ways. And I think that needs more attention. Related to that, and this I think is what Katarzyna was mentioning, that we need more entry points for the people to be active in the OSCE. There are entry points for civil society in the context of the human dimension, but not much else. Lamberto tried to open the windows of the Hofburg a bit with the security days. That then slowly became like a mini permanent council. I think we need these opportunities for the people to be a bit more engaged as they were in the 1970s and 80s. My seventh point is simply about this idea that the OSCE will end the war in Ukraine. I don't think so, but I think it can build the peace after the war. And as several of you have mentioned, that's what we should be preparing for. And in that vein, my eighth and last point would be to use the OSCE more for mill-to-mill dialogue. This type of confidence building, trust building is in very short supply. We've kicked down almost all of the ladders of the arms control system that was developed in the 1980s and 90s, not least in the context of the CSCE. And the announcement yesterday that Russia is walking away from the New START treaty, that was kind of the last thing that we had. No more CFE, no more Open Skies Treaty, no more INF, etc. So the OSCE is one of the last places where there is this mill-to-mill dialogue. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance of that.
Thanks, Walter, for giving us a good agenda. So we'll keep it in mind also to guide us through the next steps of this meeting, of this process. Cornelis, please.
Thank you. Always hard to speak after Walter. On scenarios, I personally think the zombie or abyss scenarios are very unlikely. It no longer seems to be a matter of survival in the OSCE. It's more about how to maintain the vitality and increase the vitality of the organization. To be sure, statistically, there is a fairly high risk of organizational death. So to give you one figure, over the last 200 years, around 40% of international organizations have died. but only very few large security organizations. Even the League of Nations is not a very clear case because many activities have been transferred to the United Nations. And then there are many conditions within the OSCE that are favorable to survival. That includes a very large, diverse membership, a flexible political mandate, the size of the structures and institutions, so a fairly large bureaucracy, and the location of the secretariat also matters according to academic research. But I think the Phoenix scenario might be over-optimistic. So the aim should be to enhance the vitality of the OSCE and ideally move to or enable Phoenix scenario. So as Walter said, keep the lights on. And that includes maintaining the OSCE as a forum for political dialogue. Peace negotiations or even ceasefires seem to be very unlikely at the moment. And the main problem is a revisionist Russia. So the situation is very different from the CCE, where Western states were dealing with a status quo USSR. Now, how do you deal with a state that is revisionist, that negates the right of existence of another state and nation? A very different situation from the Cold War. So in a way, it was much easier dealing with the USSR. And possibly also nowadays where peace is not in the government's interest. But that still, it means maintaining the option for future negotiations, even if the OSCE will only be one side where such negotiations will occur. So relations between Russia and NATO and Ukraine will be equally, if not more important. But at this, I think while we're speaking a few floors below, there's an FSC meeting. And such meetings, they can add an element to cooperative security, if only at the moment reduce the risk of inadvertent war, and we're talking about the risk of nuclear war. So there is a common interest. Nobody wants unwanted escalation, inadvertent escalation. And hopefully the time will come when such forums will be used, or ideally they should be used right now to discuss how to avoid an inadvertent escalation, and in the future how to go beyond that and again move towards CSBMs. So what to do practically? Continue activities, for example, in the field. Ideally, these should be consensus-based. But if that's not possible, XP, so extra budgetary contributions, become all the more important. But, and yeah, that's an important but, it requires much more consultation and commitment than what we've seen over the last years. And here parliamentarians play a crucial role, including on the budget. We're only talking very small amounts anyway. So as you know, the regular budget, unified budget, is approximately the cost of one fighter jet. So if XP becomes even more important than it is now, you need more funding, need more reliable funding and multi-year funding, because the implications of annual budget cycles for program and project implementation are severe. So it really undermines the effectiveness and efficiency of activities in the field. Last point on suspension, sort of these quarantine measures, probably any such considerations have to take into account what's happening in Moscow, the current thinking in Moscow. And there seem to be increasingly loud voices in Russia that call for the withdrawal of institutions such as the OSCE. And it has to be taken into account the risk that such measures, quarantining, for example, will reinforce the siege mentality and play into the Kremlin's narrative of Russophobia. Thank you.
Thank you, Cornelius. Okay, we move now to the concluding statement. Secretary General Montella, in inverted order.
Inverted order of importance. Secretary, and first, and then the
The order of how you spoke in the beginning.
Exactly. Lamberto, again, thank you very much for this and for all the panelists. I have 2 points. one on the Phoenix Abyss and one on the suspension or sanctioning mechanism. On the Phoenix scenario or Abyss scenario, I bet, and you will agree with me, if we had this conversation that we had this morning in the room with the ministers for 3 hours, without mobile phones, with their full attention on what we've discussed, we would be able to determine, is it Abyss or is it Phoenix? If the ministers paid attention to this discussion, they would say, this is useful, let's fund it, let's instruct our ambassadors to go full-fledged on this organization and strengthen it. Or they will say, look, it's over. And like we could decide Abyss or Phoenix today in 3 hours of the minister's attention. This is the biggest problem we have, lack of political attention. And I come to what parliamentarians can do. Parliamentarians, we hope, and we will try to kind of craft for you some speaking points and stuff, is to go in your parliament to your ministers. They are accountable to you. Oversight was mentioned. Tell your ministers, this organization is useful. We believe in it. We are parliamentarians. We observe elections. We go in many places. We've seen the value of the organization. Dear minister, when you go to the OSCE, tell your ambassador, fund it, pay attention to the organization, and don't go to the ministerial meeting in between a NATO Ministerial Council, a EU Council Affairs, and the OSCE is just in between for a couple of bilaterals and with zero attention. And then the game is left downstairs, down below, where ambassadors either decide their own game, either inform the capital or not, either receive instructions or not. But the organization is in this crisis because there is no political attention. The Helsinki Plus 50 is a tool that the politicians, the parliamentarians, are giving to the organization to save the organization by bringing back political attention to the organization. So you will fix Phoenix or Abyss with the attention of the ministers in 3 hours following this discussion. The other point is on the sanctioning mechanism. How to sanction a country that violates the rules of the, or I would say all the rules of the game, because the Parliamentary Assembly has condemned that country from 2014, saying that all the fundamental values of the OSCE have been violated. I like the idea of the pendulum box, but I would say how to sanction a country that violates the rules of the game. The first thing I would do is not to violate our own rule of the game, because then we play the same game. If we start to violate our own rule of the game, then we don't fix the problem. The OSCE Parliamentary Assembly has teeth. We've talked about what teeth can the OSCE do to sanction a country who misbehave. The Parliamentary Assembly has the teeth, because why we cannot sanction a country today is because there is a consensus rule, so it's very difficult. But the Parliamentary Assembly has all the teeth in this world to sanction a country that has violated the rules. And the Parliamentary Assembly, and this is news for you, has been sanctioning that country since 2010. Since 2010, the Parliamentary Assembly, by majority, has sanctioned that country by not having any members of the Russian Federation in the Bureau. There used to be presidents of the Duma as vice president of the USDPA, Gennady Selezhnov. There were senior members of the Duma in the Bureau. Since 2010, none. Since 2010, there are no special representatives appointed as leaders of the OSCE. Since then, no president has ever appointed a Russian as head of an election observation mission. No amendments of the Russian Federation that have been presented have been voted by the members. No supplementary items that the Russian Federation has collected signatures presented has been voted in. There are, for the administrative part of the organization, there's always been traditionally a deputy secretary general who was Russian. This was tradition. There is no more a deputy secretary general in the administrative part, but I mean, this is another issue. So we have in the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly already delivered sanctions at the political level. So I don't understand why in the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly we are trying to also make challenges to ourselves. I mean, I think the political game at the Parliamentary Assembly is in the plenary of the Parliamentary Assembly, where we vote by majority. And if you look at all our track record since 2014, since the illegal annexation of Crimea, our declarations, our actions, the actions of the president, the visits of presidents, vice presidents to Donbass, all the things that we've done show that we have been always on the right track by condemning the actions of the Russian Federation with facts, with deeds, by supporting Ukraine with the facts and the deeds that we can deliver. We are a parliamentary assembly, we are parliamentarians, we cannot deliver heavy artillery, but with our heavy artillery is our words, is our actions, and on this we have delivered 100%. So I'm very proud that we are in this setting of the Parliamentary Assembly, but I do not have a solution for how the intergovernmental organization can introduce a mechanism or a pendling box, because by dealing by consensus, the only way to introduce that would be by violating the own rule of the game. So we have to find a more creative way for the intergovernmental side of the organization. For the Parliamentary Assembly side, we are already implementing very strong sanctions. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary General. And now the concluding statement by President Sederfeld.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Sanier. First of all, thank you to our speakers. I think you have managed to give us, to take a step outside about where we are today and give other perspectives. That's very important to bring with you when you're talking about an organization today and where to be tomorrow, because there is always a tomorrow. And also, dear colleagues here, and for your remarks, and also for one of the initiator, for your comments. I think those are also mostly appreciated and needed, because if OSCE, and I think mostly on the Parliamentary Assembly, should be relevant, it needs also to be an organization that engage, that we who are elected to be a part of the organization are engaged and believe in the organization. And that's what I have found out, that the engagement is huge. And of course, that there is problem, like Dr. Heidi Frey said, the circle of an organization, how it lives from the beginning to when it's get a little bit tired, it's get old, if it's managed to renew itself, or if it's just go down in the box. And then there is the finance, and I think this is a problem for all of us. But I would also like to give a comment when saying that it's a lot of international organizations who have died. Yes, that's true. And it's the same in all countries, on the regional level, local level, national level. There is quite a high number of organizations who have died. But have they been replaced? Yes, I think so. It's just other kind of way to organize. It's another way to communicate and to be related to each other. And looking on OSCE PA and OSCE as a such, on the, including the governmental side, yes, it has been mentioned here that 1975, it was a totally different word. It was the two superpower and how to make them to connect and how it affects the rest of the world. But there is not this picture any longer. But there is one of the former superpower, Russia, who is trying to re-stabilize, to rebuild, to build come back to a superpower. But there is also other countries who have joined this match, this fight to be a big influence countries. China is one, India is another one who is working to be more influential. And this also show a bit of the difficulties, I think. And communication, it have changed a lot. We have the internet. And it's we, human beings, who are using the internet. And we are using it for bad and we are using it for good. It's the same as everywhere else, but it makes communication much faster. It's not like when we used the letter and sent to each other, or had some kind of radio communication or the fax or this. It's much faster. It's just to press the button and the whole world are knowledge. And how to handle a situation like this? It's true challenges. But I must say, I think we are, from OSCE PA, we are doing a good job. But it's not a good job if it's not recognized. if it's not known about around the world? And what can we do? I think that this is a challenge, and it was said here, bring back to the parliament, hold the government accountable. But there is also things we can do by ourselves. How many of us do report back home to our national parliament when we have been at a meeting? That's something we could really push forward in our party groups together with the speaker, that we want to have a time, an hour, to report from our meetings. That would also increase both the knowledge in parliament, but also among our colleagues. And I think we need to have this kind of thoughts. What can we do? And yes, as was said here, we are doing a lot. Just think about our winter meeting we are going to hold. I have read articles about our winter meeting. I can't read in all languages, but I have seen in Indian papers, there are articles about our upcoming winter meeting. In our papers, in daily papers in Austria, in South America. Then it's up to us to be relevant here, to show that parliamentarians, we are raising the right points that people are discussing, that people see as a threat for our society, and we are taking responsible act. Because there is an interest, there is a true interest for security, for cooperation. And let me also mention that Secretary General mentioned here, we have a lot of tools. We have the election observations. I think that's our flagship. How can we be more active here? Can we continue after the election observation to contribute to rebuild stability? We have our special representative. I did attend one meeting today where there was discussion about, with the special representative, about really relevant issues. And we as parliamentarians, we can also contribute here for relevance. I think on our ad hoc committees, counterterrorism, migration, issues that we have discussed for a long time in our parliament. But how do we communicate it? How do we know that our parliaments, that our constituencies knows what we are doing? If nobody knows it, well, then it's just a club here among us. We need to reach out. But let me also say one thing. I have come to the conclusion, I don't know if you agree with me, but OSCE is of relevance. There is problem on the governmental side with the decision making, but it's Russia who are trying to block and block a lot, but they are still sitting at the table. They put time, they put efforts. Would they do it if the organization wasn't relevant? No, they would have stepped out. So OSCE is of relevance. It's just that we need to find a way forward and incorporate. And this is the difficult, and I think we need to continue this discussion forward. And I say, once again, thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for all your efforts here and what you have put together. And I look forward further for also dialogue with our three speakers, because I think all of us need to take a step aside, outside of our assembly, and think with some new terms. Thank you very much.
Also from my part, Madam President, thank you very much for your kind words. Thanks to the speakers for very insightful, very thoughtful contribution to the debate. And I think we will have to let it sink in a way and digest some of the important things that have been said. Thank you also for proposing an agenda for action in a way. We should really act on these points. So looking ahead, we will continue this informal reflection in the context of Parliamentary Assembly, so there will be periodic meetings. I would like to encourage you to consider something, which is organize events yourselves with your parliaments on these themes, or whichever of these themes you think is of more interest. We'll support you, organize them if you wish, and involving civil society, as it was said, try to come closer to the citizens. And maybe things that can be organized by parliaments here and there could help do that. So just just consider it as yourselves, and if you want, just reach out to the secretariat, and we'll see how we can contribute or assist. So that's it for my part. Thank you very much to everybody, and wish you all the best for what seems to be a rather challenging winter meeting. As you enter the Neue Saal, maybe remember to look on your right. There's the Phoenix there. It might inspire you, maybe to be a bit more optimistic as you are approaching this difficult moments in the life of the organization and the life of the Parliamentary Assembly. So thank you very much, and yeah, we'll be in touch soon again.